Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Lost Bits right here on TetraBitGaming, the series where we explore the scrapped, unused, and unseen content in video games. So for months now, a lot of you guys have been asking for a Sonic the Hedgehog 2 Lost Bits video, and I now see why. This game probably has more unused and altered content than any other game I've covered thus far, so I'll be making not one, but two Lost Bits videos for this game. This first video will cover the various unreleased prototype builds of the game and several scrapped levels, and then in the second video we'll dive more into the final releases on the Master System, Game Gear, and of course the Genesis or Mega Drive. Alright, enough talk, go grab your anthropomorphic two-tailed fox, it's time to find some lost bits. Before the release of the Game Gear version of Sonic 2, magazines and other media outlets were given a special prototype of the game for review purposes. This prototype is simply known as the Sonic the Hedgehog 2 Auto Demo, and as the name implies, this prototype was actually not playable and was more like just a video demonstration of the game's features. Interestingly, Tails is nowhere to be found in this demo, suggesting that during the December 1991 build date of this prototype, Tails might have not even been planned to play a major role in the game yet. Outside of the usual small differences seen between the prototype and final releases, this auto demo also has some unused content found in its files. First up is a music track that can be heard in each of the zones featured in this prototype. Oddly, there is no music track even similar to this one in the final release. The auto demo prototype also contains several sprites that were unused in this build. The weirdest ones are just these creepy, unused sprites of Sonic laughing. Something about them just seems so unnatural. Here are most of the other unused graphics that are found in the prototype's files but are never normally seen. Alright, and now it's time to get to the version of Sonic 2 that probably most of us remember better, the version for the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. This version of Sonic 2 had a few pre-release prototypes that contained several things that were altered or unfortunately left out of the final build. To better understand all the changes, we must first lay out the timeline for all of these prototypes. The earliest build that we know of so far is known as the Nick Arcade prototype, due to its similarities with a build shown in the Nickelodeon Nick Arcade game show in 1992. This is such an early prototype that it still used several assets from the first Sonic the Hedgehog game. The next prototype was discovered on a Chinese GeoCities site and is known as the Simon Y prototype, named after the person who discovered it. This is another early build, although it is more complete compared to the Nick Arcade version. Apparently, the Simon Y prototype was from a demo cart that had been stolen from a toy show in New York in 1992. And lastly, there are the prototypes simply numbered betas 4 through 8, which were all internal testing builds of the game very late into its development, the last 2 weeks before release to be specific. So let's begin with the earliest build, the Nick Arcade prototype. This is the only iteration of Sonic 2 to have a mechanic in which Sonic would rebound off of a wall if he should run into one with enough speed. These are the sprites that were used for this mechanic for Sonic falling after the rebound. Gotta go slower, Sonic, gotta go slower. But boy, let me tell ya, this mechanic is super annoying in a game which is meant to be played fast. It's not often that I'm glad some things are removed from a game, but this is definitely one of those times. The Nick Arcade prototype also contains several graphics that are unused in this build as well as any other. The first of these is an animation of Sonic turning left and right. It seems the developers wanted Sonic to have an animation when turning instead of just instantly changing which way he is facing. This build also has unused sprites for Sonic running at a faster speed, as well as what looks like him running at some sort of maximum speed. Sonic appears to lean further forward the faster that he runs. Furthermore, there are unused sprites that would be used for an animation for Sonic pulling on something, probably a handle or box. Next is an unused animation of Sonic balancing on a ledge. And here are some more miscellaneous objects with varying purposes. This last spinning metal ball looks the most interesting, and it was meant to act as an obstacle that would continuously bounce on a floor. It was eventually accessible in the debug menu in the 2013 remake of the game. Now let's get to some of the unused Badniks in this prototype that never made it into the final release. First up is the Badnik named Bubbler's Mother. As the name implies, these were intended to fly around and drop bubbler enemies. Next up is B-Bat, a Bat Badnik that was also scrapped from the final release of Sonic 2. In a similar scrapped manner, there are also the Stegos or Stegways, Gators, and Bee-Fish Badniks. All of these Badniks, except for the Bee-Fish, were later reintroduced in the 2013 remake of the game. And moving on to the unused graphics in the Simon Y prototype, most of them are the same as the ones in the Nick Arcade build with a few exceptions. These exceptions are some animated drills for Metropolis Zone, some vines for Mystic Cave Zone, and most interestingly, some leftover graphics from another Sega game, Cheeky Cheeky Boys. Apparently it was common practice to reuse the chips to test prototypes, and they were often not completely erased. As a result, any data that wasn't overwritten would retain data from whatever was previously loaded. As such, these graphics for this fire and splashing from Cheeky Cheeky Boys made its way into this Sonic 2 prototype. Wild. There are also some unused monitors that appear in the Nick Arcade and Simon Y prototypes. The most interesting ones are the Mystery Monitor and the Spring Monitor. In the Nick Arcade prototype, the Mystery Monitor does absolutely nothing. But in the Simon Y prototype, it will change Sonic's color palette to that of Supersonic. However, although the colors may have changed, no additional supersonic abilities are given. The Spring Monitor has no effect in either prototype, but there are two common theories as to what they might have done. The first theory is that it would give Sonic or Tails a pogo spring that would bounce them up and down until they take damage, similar to that scene in Sonic Triple Trouble. And the other theory is that it would simply just increase Sonic or Tails' jump height in order to reach higher up areas. Moving on to betas 4 through 8, we can see many things that were altered closer to the release of the game. For instance, the main title screen underwent several iterations until it became the one we saw in the final release. This title screen was used up until Beta 5 when it was changed. What's weird is that the artwork of this original title screen actually appears in the instruction manual for the non-Japanese versions of the game, as well as in the Master System and Game Gear versions. Several other more minor changes were made in these beta versions, such as the screen positioning, the level select screen, some text graphics, and the color palettes used in the special stages. Here's a comparison of the special stage color palettes used in the Beta 4 with those used in Beta 6 and onward. You might also notice that in the older betas, the name Miles is still used. This was changed in the later betas to the nickname Tails. Other notable graphics that were changed between the beta builds include the sparkles from the invincibility power-up, and also the Stegos, who got a bit of a design update with better looking head plates, flames, and tires. Now that we've discussed all of the prototype builds, let's have a look at how some of the animations and graphics have changed between the builds. The blinking sprites for Sonic in the Nick Arcade and Simon Y builds make it look like Sonic doesn't have eyelids when he closes his eyes. I mean, it looks fine, but it's kind of weird when you start to think about it. In Beta 4 and onwards, Sonic was given proper eyelids matching the color of the rest of his skin. Interestingly, Sonic's walking animation was actually better in the early prototypes compared to the later builds and final release. In the Simon and Nick builds, the animation had 12 frames, compared to the later ones which only had 8 frames. My best guess is that this was reduced in order to save on memory usage and improve overall performance of the game. One pretty well-known change between earlier builds and the later ones is Sonic's running animation. In the earlier builds, Sonic's legs and shoes go into a blur, kind of like you'd see in a cartoon. This spinning whirl was removed in the later prototypes to look like what we saw in the final release. Another animation that changed quite a bit is that of Sonic skidding to a stop. Originally, Sonic would skid and start leaning in the opposite direction, but in later builds, he just skids and instantly turns around. And a bit of a fun fact, the beginning of the earlier used animation was eventually reused in Sonic Mania. Lastly for Sonic is his balancing animation, which was also altered. In the earlier prototypes, it was a lot more similar to the balancing animation from Sonic 1. In the Beta 4 build and onward, it was pretty much completely redone. Another pretty big change was made for the Crawl Badniks. Their sprite was essentially remade and they were given a walking animation as well as the ability to put up their shield in more than one direction. Lastly, the end goal signposts also underwent some changes between the builds. Here you can see the changes between the first Nick Arcade build and the Simon Y build and beyond. Moving along to some of the more well-known parts of these prototypes, now let's talk about all of the zones in these builds that aren't normally playable and have to be accessed via the level select cheat. At the prototype stage in the development of this game, as seen in the stage select screen, some of the prototypes still used the zone names and music from Sonic 1. In fact, Green Hill Zone from Sonic 1 can actually be played in the game. And I use the term play loosely as this stage has some pretty messed up collision and glitched out graphics. Honestly, without using debug mode, this level is basically unplayable. I mean, what? Although this act never made it into the final release of Sonic 2, there were still some alterations between the Simon Y and later prototypes. This supports the notion that Green Hill Zone might have been slated to make a return in Sonic 2. And next up are the prototypes of Chemical Plant Zone, which are still listed in the game as Marble Zone. This stage underwent some pretty big changes, even between prototypes, most notably between the Nick Arcade and Simon Y builds. The most obvious visual change is the color of the background palette, which was changed from purple to a more yellowish green color. And the actual level itself was almost completely redone. There are way too many small changes to show individually, but I'll overlay the layouts of each iteration here and you can see all of the differences for yourself. Another notable change after the Simon Y build is that the loop segments were altered and their diagonal corners were removed. Now let's move on to one of the most famous unused zones in Sonic history, the Hidden Palace Zone, which in the earlier builds still goes under the name Springyard Zone. Although the stage is unused, it is still mostly complete, suggesting that it was removed late into the game's development, despite it being believed to be one of the first levels to be worked on. It was revealed that the Hidden Palace Zone was intended to be a level where the player would be taken upon collecting all 7 of the Chaos Emeralds. The Hidden Palace Zone features several of the unused enemies I mentioned earlier, and it appears to be some sort of cavern containing remnants of an ancient civilization. There's a bit more history to this scrapped zone, but I think I'll go over it in more detail in a future video. Other oddities here are that the water doesn't affect Tails at all, as it doesn't slow his movement and he can't drown. Also, if a second controller is plugged in, the water level in the first act can be controlled by pressing up or down, probably as a debugging feature. The Hidden Palace Zone is actually accessible in the final release, but just like with the Green Hill Zone in the Nick Arcade prototype, the collision of the zone is completely goofed up. This scrapped zone was later re-added into the game in its 2013 mobile re-release as an optional zone accessible for Mystic Cave Zone Act 2. The Hidden Palace Zone name was also eventually reused for a zone in Sonic & Knuckles, and although the zone looks pretty different, it is believed that this version was based on the scrapped zone from Sonic 2. What do you get if you cross Chemical Plant Tiles, Labyrinth's Rippling, and Marble Zone's ring layouts? You get this unplayable mess. It's obvious to see that this Labyrinth Zone is broken and essentially unplayable. Under Starlight Zone, we can access an earlier version of Emerald Hill Zone, aka Green Hill Zone 2. This is the only zone that is playable in the prototypes without the use of the level select cheat. Just like with Chemical Plant Zone, Emerald Hill Zone also underwent some pretty significant layout changes between prototypes. Again, I'll show off a few of the differences between the versions here. Up next is Hilltop Zone. Since this zone is using the former Scrap Brain Zone slot, there are still several oddities here. This is fine. Again, there were several changes made between prototypes. And oftentimes, the changes made after the Nick Arcade version would fix some pretty big errors. When trying to load Scrap Brain Zone Act 3, the graphics are a bit goofed. And last up in the Nick Arcade prototype is the final zone, which just loads up Hilltop Zone Act 1 again. Going left will result in falling into a dead-end pit, and if you go right, you better like the color purple because that's all you'll see after the game crashes. Now there are methods of getting past the area that always crashes the game, but there's nothing really else to see in this act that's noteworthy. Moving on to more of the Simon Y prototype zones, since this build was further into the game's development, here we can see earlier versions of the zones that made it into the final game, as well as some more unused zones. But first, let's talk about Zone ID 1, which is an empty stage slot that can be accessed in the Simon Y build via a cheating device. Lovely, isn't it? It is believed that this stage is the same broken mess as the Labyrinth zone from the Nick Arcade build, but this time with Emerald Hills pallets. Similar cases can be seen again in Zone ID 3, Zone ID 6, Zone ID 9, Genocide City Zone, and Death Egg Zone, although each with a different color palette or lack thereof. Wait, did he say Genocide City Zone? Yup, apparently according to one of the game's developers, this scrapped zone was intended to be a mechanical-themed Act 3 of Metropolis Zone that would itself appear as a standalone zone with only one act. The genocide term was apparently chosen due to the language barrier faced by the development team. The genocide part of the zone was obviously altered due to the nature of the word, and it was changed to Cyber City after the Simon Y build. An interesting note about the Genocide City Zone is that the theme of this zone was used to create the graphics for another unreleased game called B-Bomb. These unused graphics were then later reused again in the third level in Sonic Spinball, The Machine. Like I mentioned earlier, several of the zones that would make it into the final game have early versions in the Simon Y build that also had some changes in future prototype builds. Some of these changes were pretty significant, like the ones in Casino Night Zone, where originally the stages looked pretty unfinished. Here I'll just quickly show a few more examples of the changes in Casino Night Zone, and other levels including Oil Ocean Zone, Aquatic Ruin Zone, which was originally named Neo Green Hill Zone, and Mystic Cave Zone, which was mistakenly listed as Dust Hill Zone. Dust Hill Zone is another pretty famous zone that was scrapped from Sonic 2, and as the name implies, it was to be a desert-themed stage. Soon after Sonic 2 was first announced, Sega distributed 3 concept screenshots of the game, mixing assets from Sonic 1 and 2. These screenshots were of Emerald Hill Zone, Hidden Palace Zone, and a desert stage which was eventually identified to be a mock-up of Dust Hill Zone by developer Hirokazu Yasuhara. To this day, no actual playable form of this zone has ever been found, and only some remnants of it are believed to be found in other prototypes and the final release. It is speculated that Dust Hill Zone would serve as inspiration for Desert Dazzle, an area intended for the 2011 remake of Sonic CD, which itself was also scrapped from the game. Both Dust Hill Zone and Desert Dazzle are believed to be big inspirations for the Mirage Saloon Zone, which did finally make its way into Sonic Mania. Alright, next up is Wood Zone, yet another zone that didn't make it into the final release. This stage is pretty small, and as you can see, it's definitely nowhere close to being finished. The zone is pretty buggy, and if you aren't using debug mode, much of it is inaccessible. Only the palette and music data from Wood Zone made their way into the final release of Sonic 2, and they can still be loaded into the game's Emerald Hill Zone. Since the playable prototype version in the Simon Y build still used the Metropolis Zone music, it was originally speculated that Wood Zone was a sort of past version of Metropolis Zone. It was later revealed that it was actually supposed to be a present version of Casino Night Zone instead. Yep, that's right, Sonic 2 was originally planned to have a time travel aspect. I'm assuming something similar to what was used in Sonic CD. I hope you aren't sick of levels that were scrapped from this game yet, because there's a few more to talk about. The rest of these aren't found in the prototypes or final release and were only revealed in developer notes and interviews. As far as anyone knows, none of these made it past the design stage of development. Several of these unused zones can be seen in these early development sketches that Hirokazu Yasuhara showed off at a game industry event in Poland in 2017. Rockworld Zone is speculated to have also been part of the game's intended time travel mechanic, and would have been a past version of Dust Hill Zone. Winter Zone was apparently just going to be a winter reskin of Dust Hill Zone, in which the zone would be covered in snow and Christmas trees would replace the cacti. Again, maybe intended as a future form of Dust Hill Zone or something? And next we can see Olympus. Due to the Greek origin of the word, it is believed that it was the original name for Aquatic Ruin Zone, which also features Greek-style ruins throughout the level. In these development sketches, we can also see a Sand Shower Zone, Ocean Wind Zone, Blue Lake Zone, and Tropical Plant Zone. Not much information is really known about these zones, and whether they are just development names for zones that were changed, or entirely new zones that were never really worked upon, is still a mystery. And with that concludes this first Lost Bits video on the prototypes of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure to check out the second part of the Sonic 2 Lost Bits, which will cover more of the unused content that didn't make it into the final release, as well as the game's debug mode by clicking on the card right here when it's released. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to cover all of the unused and altered content from these prototypes, so if you want to read up on them some more, be sure to check out my sources in the description. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to let me know with a like down below, and also comment what other games you'd like to see me make a Lost Bits video on next. And if you would like to stay even more up to date with me and the channel, subscribe here and follow me over on my other social media things, which will all be linked in the description below. But as always guys, thank you all so much for watching today and for all of your amazing support, and I will see you in a bit.